What is life? According to science, life is anything with DNA, chemical reactions, or cells. But as Christians, we know life to be much less tangible. We know animal carcasses and plants both have DNA, cells, and chemical reactions. But neither of those things are alive. So why do evolutionists insist on defining life by these inaccurate terms?
That's an easy question. Biologists don't actually define life based on the presence of DNA, cells, or chemical reactions.
Bubbles? Are you going to pop up every time I debunk science?
Well, that probably depends on the ratings, but that is the plan.
I don't suppose there's anything I can do to stop you.
Since you're just a disembodied voice, no, there's nothing you can do to stop me. Because misrepresenting what science says about life to our fellow Christians can leave them vulnerable to doubt when they find out what scientists actually say what life is. So, is life just a collection of DNA and cells? Is life exclusive to only animals? Is life rising from nothing as inherently absurd as it sounds? Will I stop asking rhetorical questions before the intro starts? There's only one way to find out.
We know that death didn't exist until Adam and Eve ate the apple in the Garden of Eden. And yet, Adam, Eve, and the animals must have eaten plants. Plants are never referred to as living in the Bible, so we can reasonably draw the conclusion that plants aren't alive. But plants have cells and DNA, so obviously those can't be the basis of life.
I would have to agree with you on that. Cells aren't present in all living forms because cells themselves are living things. And while all life has DNA, the presence of DNA does not make something alive. After all, a corpse still has DNA even once it's unequivocally dead. Most biologists will tell you that life is defined by its capacity to grow, metabolize, respond to stimuli, maintain homeostasis, reproduce, and whether or not it's organized. The important thing to remember, apart from the fact that the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell, is that all these processes break down once the organism dies.
But the definition you gave is too broad. According to your definition, plants, animals, and humans would all be considered life, even though the Bible only refers to humans and animals as being alive.
Well, what definition would you use?
Well, the most fundamental characteristic of life is the ability to move on its own. Every creature described as living in Genesis 1 is also described as being able to move.
So, if a human gets paralyzed, are they no longer alive? Depending on who you ask, there are 5 or 6 kingdoms of life, which is just the way biologists categorize different kinds of life. There's the fun-loving gentlemen of the fungi kingdom, the ones that plant move in the plant kingdom, the party animals in the animal kingdom, the professional tistas of the protista kingdom, and the lonely fellows at the Monera kingdom. Although some biologists would divide that kingdom into Archaebacteria and Eubacteria.
It's got to be a sin to use so many puns in one sentence. But everything you just listed is very different from each other. How can they all be life?
That's a great question. Let's look at how each kingdom meets the criteria of life. I've also included non-living things on here for comparison, viruses and rocks. So, are all these things organized in a consistent way? In other words, do they follow a hierarchy that can be followed from smallest to largest? Animals, plants, fungi, protists, and Monera can all be broken down into smaller, organized parts. viruses are also organized, but rocks are not. Next, do these things metabolize energy? Animals, plants, fungi, protists, and Monera certainly do, but viruses and rocks do not. Can these things grow? Again, animals, plants, fungi, protists, and Monera can, but viruses and rocks do not. And do they maintain homeostasis, which just means regulating themselves to maintain balance? Once again, animals, plants, fungi, protists, and Monera do, but viruses and rocks do not. Living things also respond to their environment, but non-living things can't. Plants will bend towards light, Monera will move away from toxic chemical reactions, and, well, I probably don't need to explain how animals respond to their environment. Lastly, living things need to be able to reproduce. Some organisms, such as animals, do this sexually. All that means is two parent organisms both contribute genetic material to the offspring. Other organisms, such as bacteria, reproduce asexually, which means that a single parent contributes all of the genetic material to the offspring. Rocks obviously don't reproduce, and viruses can't reproduce without hijacking the host cell.
But what about movement? Surely the ability to move on its own is a factor in determining if something is alive.
Nope. While animals, protists, and Monera are all able to move on their own, so can viruses, which are not alive. Also, plants and fungi, which are also alive, cannot move on their own.
Okay, but all these life forms seem pretty complex. Isn't it absurd to suggest it all came from nothing? After all, we haven't been able to create life from nothing in all of human history.
Let me start by saying I fully believe that God is the origin of life. But the idea of chemicals in a primordial soup mixing together to create life isn't any more ridiculous than an all-powerful God creating the entire universe in just 6 days. And just because we haven't been able to do something yet, doesn't mean it's impossible. From the beginning of humanity to just 50 years ago, it was impossible for humans to walk on the moon. And yet, we still managed to figure out the science necessary to send people up there. I'm not saying Christians should believe that life came from nothing, but we should at least recognize that saying we've never observed it happening isn't a good counter-argument. And we should also recognize that the creation account in Genesis was describing an event that happened, and not giving us a hard definition of life.
But as Christians, we should take the Bible at face value. If it doesn't describe something as being alive, then we shouldn't consider it alive.
If you want to have a separate, religious-based definition of what life is, then that's fine. Lots of words have two meanings. The meaning of life is the foundation for a lot of modern biology, so it's important to recognize how science defines life.
Huh. That's a fair point. Thanks, Bubbles. And if I'm going to make sound, logical arguments against scientific theories, I should probably make sure I have all the details of those theories right.
Exactly. You don't have to believe something in order to understand it. See you next time. Thanks for watching my video. Let me know in the comments if you liked it, and go ahead and smash that subscribe button. If you didn't like the video, please tell me why. I promise, I won't cry. Till next time, have a great week.